Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Frederick Lamb, Professor Emeritus of the Department of Physics and Astronomy here at UIUC and faculty member of the Arms Control and Domestic and International Security Program.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this symposium, and I'm happy to have a chance to talk about the North Korean nuclear program. I think this is a very important question. I think that if we handle this question well, we will have time to address many of the other important issues about North Korea, many of which have come up earlier. For example, human rights, the welfare of the North Korean people, various other aspects of North Korea. If we don't handle this well, then we could end up with millions of Koreans, Japanese, and Americans dead, and tens of millions seriously injured. So that's why I think it's very important that we pay attention to this question. I think that this is something that we need to pay attention to and try to think about how we move forward. So I'm going to start by telling you my main conclusions, and then, at least in part, try to support those conclusions afterwards. So, North Korea now has at least 30 and perhaps as many as 70 relatively sophisticated and powerful nuclear weapons, and may be building as many as 12 more every year. North Korea likely has deployed about a dozen nuclear-armed ICBMs currently capable of striking the continental United States, and is probably deploying several more every year. The only defense the United States military defense has currently would almost certainly be ineffective against an attack by North Korean ICBMs. So those are the kind of military facts. I think we also can see from history, and also not just from North Korea, but other countries like Iran, any country with moderately high technical capability can build and deploy nuclear weapons if they decide to do so. And the only way to stop them would be to have a horrendous nuclear war, or at least a horrendous war. Consequently, I think the only way to reduce the nuclear threat to the United States posed by North Korea is for the United States to address North Korea's deep security concerns. In the past, the countries that have actually reduced their nuclear forces or given them up did so only after gaining confidence that their security concerns had been and would be addressed indefinitely. So I think a key question here is that this will require a major shift in the thinking of many people in the United States, including the White House, the Defense Department, the State Department, Congress, the think tanks, and academia, to confront the situation realistically. I think it's completely unrealistic to expect North Korea to give up this hard-won nuclear capability without absolute confidence in their security. So let me then turn to some events and the story of North Korea's nuclear weapons program and its interactions with the wider world is an extremely complicated story. So I can't hope to actually describe it in any depth, but what I've decided to do is to pick out some lessons, and then I would like to take the time to go over a few key historical events. The narrative that the United States has always been hostile and untrustworthy in its interactions with North Korea is not accurate. Well, I'll start out by saying that because usually it's the reverse that's talked about, but as you'll see, it's more complicated than that. I think it's also true the narrative that North Korea has always been hostile and untrustworthy is also not accurate. The interactions between the United States and North Korea have been plagued by fear, misunderstandings, and domestic politics on both sides. And we need to understand this history better in order not to continue to repeat these kinds of mistakes. And I think unfortunately, the things that have happened in the last couple of years have continued to make some of these mistakes. The United States has consistently focused on ending North Korea's nuclear capabilities, whereas North Korea has placed much greater value on obtaining assurance from the United States that it will not attack North Korea and will normalize relations. So it's kind of the two sides talking past each other. It's a little bit like the Non-Proliferation Treaty in a smaller scale. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is viewed by the countries that have nuclear weapons is all about preventing other countries from getting them. The countries that don't have nuclear weapons is all about getting assurance to nuclear technology. North Korea's nuclear weapons program is a huge effort that's been underway for 25 years. It's motivated by deep security concerns, and at best it will take many years to convincingly address these concerns in other ways. So reversing the program will take years. Given the history of the United States in its interactions with other countries that have nuclear programs, and the terrible things that happen to those countries, or even looking at, as I'll describe, some of the events with North Korea, our internal politics and changes in political parties in power have caused us to be incredibly inconsistent. So I think any other country looking at the United States as a partner would have a very grave difficulty in seeing us as a trustworthy and consistent partner. North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons has been deliberate and determined. It's been patient, not surprising in the things that it's done, and not very secretive. In fact, quite the contrary. I may mention a few of the examples, but North Korea has gone to considerable lengths to communicate in detail to the public, but also in particular to nuclear experts, its nuclear program, including, inviting the head of Los Alamos Laboratory to Pyongyang and showing him what he was totally convinced was plutonium metal that had improperly worked and could be easily made into a bomb, showing delegations of scientists, the huge centrifuge hall, modern centrifuges, P2 centrifuges, and so on. And why would they be doing this? I think it makes complete sense if their goal is deterrence. It doesn't do anyone any good, it doesn't do them any good to have a nuclear capability if it's not believed, if it's not credible. How to make it credible? You demonstrate it, you test it on, you test the missiles. I think that one of the unfortunate things is the tendency to underestimate the desire and capability, which of course in the deterrence picture drives the person trying to establish deterrence to do more and more to demonstrate that they really do have the capability, and that's not a good direction for anyone. So North Korea's program has slowed at times and sometimes reversed during periods of intense diplomatic activity, but has never been abandoned. And I'll talk in a minute about why I think there were slowdowns and some reversals. Unfortunately, U.S. diplomacy since 2000 has been sporadic, reactive, and often hostile. The U.S. strategy has been to try to force North Korea to end all its nuclear and missile activities immediately, rather than to seek to manage the risk posed by these activities. This strategy has not been successful, and I think there's little prospect that such an approach will succeed in the future. So here's a diagram that shows North Korean missile and nuclear tests, and these are the, let's put the microphone stand here, but broken up into the areas of the three different leaders. If I could call attention to this intense activity here in the early 1990s, and then there was actually almost no activity here until the early 2000s. And then a big surge in activity, then a downturn, and then a huge activity in the most recent period. There's really 100% correlation between when IAEA, UN inspectors were in North Korea, and also sometimes US expert inspectors, and the lack of activity. And that also corresponds with when there were agreements that were more or less in place. As I'll talk in a minute, I think there are, even though I think it's not reasonable to think that we can get North Korea to give up its nuclear program, there are still important reasons why we might seek to slow the program down or halt it at its current level. And I'll come to that in a few minutes. So here's some major historical developments. One of them was in 1992-94. North Korea ratified the Non-Proliferation Treaty safeguards. They came into force when IAEA inspectors went into the country. There was discrepancies with the plutonium accounting by North Korea, and that was questioned. I think in retrospect, we realized that, yes, there were discrepancies. It was plutonium that was not accounted for was actually quite small in quantity, but it was made into a big confrontation. North Korea threatened to withdraw from the NPT. The Security Council passed a resolution about it. Then eventually North Korea proposed a package deal to address all issues dividing the U.S. and North Korea. And the U.S. insisted on resumption of the inspections first before talking about such an agreement. And by the way, the U.S. Made known that it planned to attack North Korea's nuclear facilities. And in the midst of this, Kim Il-sung died. So there was some question about whether his successor would actually want to or be able to continue this negotiation, but they did. And North Korea agreed to resumption of the inspections. The U.S. suspended its military exercises in South Korea, and this agreed framework was signed. So again, the U.S. regarded the agreed framework as a non-proliferation agreement, whereas North Korea placed greater value on the measures normalizing relations. The commitments in the agreed framework, by the way, were voluntary and non-binding, something that has been overlooked. North Korea had 2 graphite moderated reactors, which are ideal for making plutonium for nuclear weapons, and they were to be replaced by 2 light water reactors, which have much more proliferation resistance. And that was supposed to be completed by 2003. The U.S. was in the interim to supply oil for heating and electricity until the new reactors came online. And the U.S. also promised full normalization of relations and a formal peace and national security assurances against the threat or use of nuclear weapons against North Korea. So, almost immediately this agreement began to unravel. Within 2 weeks of the agreement being signed, a different party took over the U.S. Congress, Republicans took over. They were completely hostile to the whole idea of any agreement with North Korea. They strongly opposed it. They blocked any funding for it. They blocked any normalization of relations or removal of any economic sanctions. In fact, to get anything to happen, the U.S. had to go to its allies to get funding. So, as the leader of the director of this program said, this was a political orphan within 2 weeks of its signing. In 1998, U.S. officials testified to Congress that North Korea had not violated any key aspects of the agreed framework, but the fuel oil shipments and construction of the light water reactors were delayed. North Korea voiced its anger over the delays and warned it would restart its nuclear research if the U.S. did not install the promised light water reactors. And late in the 1990s, it began covertly to seek uranium enrichment technology. So, by the way, the agreed framework said nothing about uranium enrichment. It was entirely focused on plutonium. It was a north-south agreement that said there would be no enrichment anywhere. So it did violate that. Although the claim was that the agreed framework superseded that, but that's, I think, an excuse. So, by 1999, the U.S. had not reduced sanctions, had not normalized relations, or even begun construction on the light water reactors. North Korea warned it would resume nuclear research unless the U.S. kept its promises. The U.S. Clinton administration was aware of the North Korean interest in uranium enrichment and their efforts there, but it judged it best to deal with these in a way that preserved the agreed framework. And why would they make such a decision? Let me just point out that if North Korea had proceeded without the restrictions imposed by the agreed framework, they would have acquired enough plutonium to build 50 nuclear weapons every year, 50 each year, from 1995 to 2003. So the fact that they were unable to do that because of the restrictions that the agreed framework imposed, I think was a major accomplishment, and particularly in retrospect. So I can understand why that decision was made. In 1999-2000, there were some promising developments for constraining the program. North Korea's medium and long-range missile programs raised U.S. concerns, and Clinton asked former Secretary of Defense Perry to review U.S. policy. He traveled to Pyongyang, and North Korea agreed to a moratorium on long-range rocket launches. That is not only missiles, but also space launch. And in return, the U.S. removed some of the economic sanctions that had been imposed. And as was described earlier today, in 2000, Vice Marshal Jo Myung-rok visited Clinton at the White House. The U.S. and North Korea issued a joint communique pledging to fundamentally improve their bilateral relations and build a relationship free from past enmity. And it was also mentioned Secretary Albright visited in Pyongyang. But within a couple of weeks after these communiques and so on were put in place, then again there was a presidential election, and the Republicans took over, and Bush immediately abandoned what had been put in place. In fact, it was far worse than that. On his first day in office, he placed a private phone call to Kim Jong-il in which he ridiculed Kim Jong-il, and then after the call, publicly ridiculed him. He ignored the joint communique completely and drastically cut almost to zero any diplomatic contacts. North Korea sent an ambassador to Washington to signal that it wished to continue the talks, but he was not received. In 2002, of course, Bush labeled North Korea part of an axis of evil, and the U.S. openly discussed preemptive attacks against North Korea. It halted all fuel deliveries, and it sent a delegate to North Korea to confront them about the uranium enrichment with instructions just to confront them and walk out, not to have any discussions whatsoever. Kim Jong-il sent a personal message to the U.S. seeking to get the diplomacy back on track, but it was summarily rejected by Bush. And then North Korea warned that it would end its freeze if the U.S. hostility continued. And at the end of that year, it asked the IAEA inspectors to leave. And in 2003, North Korea said that it was converting its processing facilities to produce a nuclear deterrent. It restarted its 5-megawatt reactor, and this is the occasion when it invited the head of Los Alamos to come and showed him fabricated plutonium metal and discussed with him and others, U.S. representatives, technical representatives, its nuclear program in detail. And I think that object, as I mentioned before, was to now say that we have a nuclear deterrent, and it's thought that probably North Korea assembled its first primitive nuclear device in 2003. In 2005, it announced it had manufactured nuclear weapons, and the U.S. initiated new financial sanctions and reneged on the six-party agreement that had been agreed with other countries within hours after having signed it. So this kind of completely unraveled things in terms of any kind of diplomatic effort or arms control agreement. Another event was the so-called Leap Day Agreement. And that agreement placed a moratorium signed by North Korea and the United States on North Korean missile and nuclear tests. It froze its nuclear activities, resolved the uranium enrichment issues, and it allowed IAEA inspectors back into Pyongyang. If that had been able to be kept in place, it would basically have prevented the development of nuclear weapons that could be placed on missiles, and it would have very much prevented the development of long-range missiles. But this is really bizarre. There was no joint agreement or statement. Each side separately announced the agreement in its own press release. Then, when North Korea later attempted a satellite launch, the U.S. walked away from the agreement and North Korea's missile and nuclear program went surging ahead. The reason the U.S. walked away is it claimed that North Korea had agreed to a moratorium on long-range missile tests, and the U.S. interpreted space launch as a missile test. But that's actually, of course, both sides had their own agendas. But if you want to ban space launch, you should say you want to ban space launch, because in particular the Outer Space Treaty guarantees North Korea the right to launch space launches if nothing else is intervened. So the U.S. and North Koreans said that yes, they had agreed to ban on missile tests, but not on space launches. And by the way, the space launch vehicle that they were testing is pretty terrible if attempted to be used as a missile. There, of course, is overlap in the technologies, but it's not, by any stretch of the imagination, desirable missile. So here's what happened now in this period. North Korea developed its nuclear weapon capability. I think the first test, experts all agree, was partly faulty. But then they proceeded to do some more development. I think by the 2016 test, it's quite possible they had a thermonuclear proof of concept test. And the second test, they got to 20 kilotons or so. And then, of course, in September 2017, the yield is estimated to be about 250 kilotons. So that's quite consistent with this two-stage thermonuclear weapon. It would be very, very difficult to create a fission weapon with that kind of yield. Even a boosted fission weapon is kind of difficult. And of course, in this period from 2016 to 2017, their missile program raced ahead, developing intermediate-range missiles and two types of ICBMs. So one thing I would say is that despite all these developments, I think in some sense, Kim Jong-un, by saying that they'd achieved their goals, he was quitting while he was ahead, because there's still a lot of questions to do with the reliability of their nuclear weapons and whether whether they could be placed on the missiles and how well they would survive the missile flight and so on. They had no chance to develop that, but they had made a point. As far as the missiles themselves, this is a remarkable, the 2017-16 tests were a remarkable achievement, because historically, it's only after about 16 missile tests that missiles have become reliable. Usually there's many, many failures along the way, usually more than half. So this is a remarkable achievement, and it's quite possible that additional tests would lead to failures, and so in some sense would undercut the deterrent value. So we saw models of the miniaturized implosion weapon shrunk to fit on a missile. It's unclear whether this model has anything really closely to do with the actual weapon, but it was designed to illustrate for people who are technically non-built just what they were thinking about and the kind of components, including the possibility of boosted fission and so on, that you could see the pieces that would be appropriate if that was the case. And then the peanut bomb, which was clearly designed to illustrate that they at least had the concept for how you make a two-stage thermonuclear weapon. And again, it's rather remarkable that a country would actually show these kinds of presumed details about their nuclear weapons. Typically, these are kept ultra secret. So again, I think the only thing you can read from this is that the purpose of this is actually to impress on the outside world their deterrent capability. And then the Hwasong 15 ICBM tested in 2017. It's a road mobile missile, so it can be hidden in tunnels and so on and brought out quickly, raised and fired. And it has been assessed to have a range that's able to reach any place in the United States. Can the U.S. rely on missile defense to defend against North Korean ICBMs? The answer is no. I can go into much more detail if someone really cares, but the tests that have been done are highly scripted. The missile interceptors that were used in many of the tests are not the interceptors that are actually in place in the ground currently, nor are the kill vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. But even so, with these highly scripted tests, not even against ICBMs, since the system was nominally deployed, the success rate is 5 of 11, and in only 3 of the last 6 tests was supposed much improved interceptors have succeeded. So the argument has been made that, well, we'll fire 2, 3, or 4 interceptors against every missile. Well, it's true that we have 40 interceptors, so maybe you could take on 10 ICBMs, but it still doesn't work very well. So it's not clear that you actually would do any better firing more missiles, because if they all have a design defect, they're all going to fail. So assuming that that's not the case, it's just a random thing. To take, for example, if there's 5 warheads and you put 4 interceptors on it, each with a 50% probability of success, the chance of one of the warheads getting through and exploding is about 30%. So the question, if you want to rely on this, the question is, take that into consideration. A 200 kiloton airburst over any major U.S. city could kill 1 million people almost instantly and probably injure many millions more. So what probability of that are you willing to accept? 30%? Probably not. 10%? I don't think so. 5? 1%? Really? No, I don't think so. So I think we basically have to accept that we do not have any really useful capability. So what strategy might work? I think the U.S. will have to change its strategy fundamentally, adopting a step-by-step approach that remains consistent over many years, and even with changes in the political party in power, in order to have any chance of getting to significant mitigation of the North Korean program. But I think if we can achieve any of this, it will be helpful. So possible actions the U.S. could take would be to provide formal assurance that it will not attack North Korea, and offer a step-by-step approach to normalizing relations, and also a step-by-step approach to removing sanctions. North Korea could enter into this by formally extending its current moratorium on testing nuclear weapons and on testing intermediate and long-range ballistic missiles. I could go into details. That would be extremely important in mitigating and limiting the threat to the United States. Where they stand right now is much less a serious threat. It's a serious threat, but much less than if they were to continue their testing of nuclear weapons and missiles. This would be very significant. It's nothing to be sniffed at. Halting production of plutonium and highly enriched uranium, and by the way, in the way that could be done, it would also limit tritium production. Tritium decays over time, and that would eliminate their boosted fission of thermonuclear capability. And then to allow IAEA inspectors back to its facilities at Yongbyon, and perhaps later at its other uranium enrichment facilities. So that's my suggestion. But I think that there are political problems to achieving this, which that's kind of beyond my ability to deal with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lam. Now is question time, so any question for our speakers?
Have we completely floored you? Shell shock. Professor Lam, thank you. Thank you for this very lucid presentation. I have no question for you. This is exactly the thing I would have said. So I think it was really a very succinct summary of where we stand. And I think where you hold back from political things is really where the crux is.
Yes.
How do you build political will in the US to do what diplomacy does, which is to agree with the party you do not agree with, in order to prevent the worst. But in fact, I had a question for Professor Singer.
Because I can just respond to your own question for a second. I think that accepting the reality of the situation is a precursor to thinking differently about it. There is so much pretense about what has happened and about the U.S. missile defense capabilities and other things that really get in the way of confronting the reality. And I think if we can confront the reality, then it's possible maybe to move on the policy.
Professor Singer, your third conclusion on the conditions for South Korea to develop nuclear capability, and the fact that you referred to Japan as well, they're sitting on a pile of plutonium, and you rate the possibility of Japan moving forward. I'm puzzled by how you neutralize, so to speak, the threat of Japan, particularly in the third scenario. I would think that the risk of Japan going nuclear is much bigger than the risk of South Korea going nuclear.
Well, there are two reasons, particularly South Korea eventually does build nuclear weapons. There are two reasons, very compelling reasons from a national interest perspective for Japan not to build nuclear weapons. One is that and you see this when the missiles fly over Japan, and when people who know about this young woman has been said to have been abducted from Japan. She's a cause célèbre still in Japan, who's said to be in North Korea. There's a tremendous resonance about the concern about North Korea in Japan. Because North Korea has nuclear weapons and Japan doesn't. If there's a nuclear deterrence relationship inside the Korean Peninsula, particularly if it's limited to the very low levels that would be necessary for any rational person in either side to think would be sufficient, right? Short-range missiles, weapons, easy to deliver, and so forth. They don't have to be, compact the way they would for intercontinental ballistic missiles. For all those reasons, if there were a deterrence relationship between North and South Korea, it should, in principle, alleviate Japanese concerns. The other compelling reason for Japan not to develop nuclear weapons is how it would affect their relationship with China, both in terms of military relationship but also the trade relationship with China. It would be extremely expensive for Japan. They have the ability to develop, because particularly since they're continuing to reprocess the plutonium from the reactors that were shut down at the Fukushima accident, and many of those have weapons or near weapons-grade plutonium in them. They are now in a position to make a very large nuclear arsenal in a very short amount of time. Why would they want to do that? I mean, China's not going to launch a capability of invading Japan and has absolutely no plausible reason for doing that. The only thing they can imagine happening is some nationalistic fervor on both sides over the Senkaku Islands or something like that, or what the Chinese call them, that would lead to a gradual escalation of tensions. Then Japan, doesn't need to have an intact nuclear arsenal. They just have to need the ability to tell the Chinese, you push us too far, we can do it. Right? So although I understand because of the history between Japan and Korea, why the South Korean public might be very concerned about precipitating a Japanese nuclear program. The fact of the matter is that there are very compelling reasons for Japan not to do that in any case. In fact, that's the logic, whether the logic penetrates people's heads is another question.
The question is whether politics are very logical.
Yeah.
Another question?
I guess a comment and a question. So, I think I do agree with Professor Singer on the point regarding Japan developing nuclear weapons. Because of the history, literally going back 1,000 years in that part of the world, if you ask the nations that make up that part of the world, if there's a country that they would be more concerned about having nuclear weapons than North Korea is Japan. I think because of the history. And I think that the level of concern that will come not only from South Korea but from China, Japan, on nuclear will be at a level that I think Japan will be taking a great economic risk to try to develop that. And whether it's South Korea or Japan developing nuclear weapons, of course, we're heading the wrong direction. I mean, that's not what we want. But I think, going back to Dr. Lamb's point about accepting reality, and as human beings, it doesn't matter what nation you're from, I think we're not very good at accepting reality sometimes. And certainly this country and the political leadership has not been a model of accepting reality, whether it's climate change or healthcare debates in this country, or North Korea and its nuclear program. And I guess people, the Congress is very divided in this country, and there are very few things they agree on. But probably North Korea and nuclear weapons is probably one thing that people on both sides of the aisle seem to agree on, because there's very little political cost for them to hold their current position. And for anybody to take the opposite position is going to be political suicide. And I guess the question is, in this kind of environment, how do you go about changing that? How do you go about having leaders accept the reality and realize that maybe demanding upfront denuclearization by North Korea as an entry condition for any negotiation or normalization really is a complete unrealistic.
And I could address that. I think we tend to be a little blinkered here about the U.S. role in things, because the real answer to this question really lies in South Korea, not in the United States. There's a South Korea, and the North Koreans, if you look at the 1972 declaration, for example, they're very clear, they've been very clear about what they want. You just have to listen. They want outside powers, China and, from the South Korean point of view, the North Korean point of view, outside powers agreement. They want a resolution of a peace treaty between the two countries, right? Or the two parts of the country, for some way of looking at it. If the United States can't do military exercises in South Korea without South Korea's agreement, right? Now, so far, I think, as we saw the run-up to Hanoi, the South Koreans encouraged the dialogue, but we're not willing to say, okay, and we think you ought to talk about getting U.S. military out of South Korea in a gradual way, because they don't trust that the United States is serious about the dialogue. But in the end, they have the ability to fix the problem. They have the ability to do a negotiation on their own. They have the ability to offer the North Koreans what the North Koreans appear to want, right? Which is basically an implementation of this 1972 joint declaration. And so I think the better question to ask is, and we have experts here about Korea, how do you see things developing in South Korea with respect to this question? Because they're also ones who have to recognize the reality of the situation, but they're a lot closer to it than the Americans are, and maybe, or maybe not, maybe more or maybe less likely to be able to recognize the reality because they're closer to it. So I'd be interested in comments on that from our experts in the audience.
Hi, Sung-Yun Lee from Calfix.
Oh, yeah.
Just a couple of points. First, on the breakdown of Leap Day agreement, so-called, that Professor Lam referred to, North Korea and the United States reaching an agreement on February 29, 2012, in return for the U.S. providing 240,000 tons of nutrition aid. North Korea would abide by a moratorium on nuclear and missile tests. On the point that North Korea justified its satellite launch in mid-April as something that's a sovereign right, and that North Korea had never agreed to that, to self-deterrence, to stop from launching a satellite. The U.S. Special Representative for North Korea policy at the time, Lynn Davis, has said off and on the record that that issue was specifically addressed in his meetings with North Korean counterparts leading up to the agreement, and North Korea had promised not to. His boss formally retired, but still kind of putting the street. Stephen Bosworth also has confirmed. Gary Seymour, who was on Obama's deliberations at the National Security Council. They've all confirmed that North Korea fully, clearly, under history.
So why wasn't that in the actual text of either side?
Well, there was no text. So,
Well, there were press releases, that's the only text.
there were press
It
releases.
was not in either press release.
No, it was not in any press release. So what the Obama administration did not understand then was, why would they renege on something they promised to? They had said, we will include it on February 29th, and then on March 16th, they declared they were going to launch a satellite. And Obama got very upset. And in his meeting with President Hu, about a week later at the Nuclear Security Summit in Seoul, Obama yelled at Hu and said, you keep telling me we can trust those crazy people. And Obama was very irate. But my point here is North Korea lies all the time. Strategic deception is an essential arsenal of the North Korean playbook. They don't abide by international norms of good faith negotiation. And of course, that was the centennial of Kim Il-sung's birthday, April 15th, and just a few months since Kim Jong-un had come into power. So launching a missile or satellite, celebrating with a bang, was really essential to bolstering Kim Jong-un's credentials. On this slide, your suggestion that the U.S. provide formal assurances of no attack, it's been done in writing and speech many, many times. It's in the 94 Agreed Framework, 6-party joint statements, and so on. I take the view North Korea in calling for a peace treaty, peace agreement since 1972, has in its mind a step-by-step process for evicting U.S. troops from the Peninsula. After a peace agreement, the raison d'etre of U.S. troops would come under fire, question why are they there, and would create the conditions for partial and then full withdrawal of U.S. troops from South Korea in the name of peace. Of course, we know that peace, as tantalizing as it sounds, peace treaties and non-aggression pacts sometimes don't really work out. For example, the Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 that brought on war and then full communization of Vietnam. So it seems North Korea does have a game plan and is very good at playing on fears of an imminent U.S. attack. But we know that on the record, the U.S. has never really hit back when North Korea is killing Americans and South Koreans. So a nation that has never abided by, has always without fail violated flagrantly both the letter and spirit of every international agreement signed, saying that we are fearful, so we need some peace guarantee assurance. I think that's a really wrong. As to your suggestion that the U.S. should offer a step-by-step approach to removing sanctions, those are stipulated actually in sections 401 and 402 of the North Korea Sanctions Policy Enhancement Act of 2016. The U.S. would be amenable to suspending sanctions for 6 months and a year if North Korea stops counterfeiting, proliferating, releases unlawfully detained foreign nationals. If North Korea opens up a little bit and takes some steps toward dismantlement, then the U.S. will suspend sanctions. Full termination of sanctions comes much later. But these proposals have been made repeatedly in the past, and North Korea, in my view, is the party that has not been willing to abide by them.
So I might respond to part of that. I think that one of the things we have to bear in mind is that the United States has changed its directions on many agreements when different parties came into power. And so even when we've had written agreements, look at the Iran nuclear deal, it can't really be assured to someone who's entering into that agreement and is taking almost irreversible steps that they can count on the U.S. to actually consistently abide by it. So it's not only North Korea that may have a problem there. I would say there are these various written statements, but there are also plenty of statements and actions by the United States that it was preparing to attack North Korea and threatening North Korea publicly. Our current president has done that. So we don't know how to take those into account when there's some other pieces of paper that say that no, we won't do that. So I think it's a bit more complicated than maybe what we presented.
Another question? Two questions.
Are there any grounds for optimism about, are there any grounds for optimism about the U.S. response and policies towards the Korean Peninsula? There's a political movements underway, or people convincing others?
I'd have to say that I have almost no idea what's going to happen with the current U.S. administration and what they will decide to do. So it's very difficult. I don't think I can say one way or the other. I think perhaps a hopeful sign was that, if you can call it that President Trump was not seemingly confined by previous thinking on this matter. And I think some fresh thinking is probably needed. I'm not sure his thinking is quite what we, I'm not actually sure what